The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the rise, 1299 to 1520. The world that would give birth to the Ottoman Empire was one of ruin and chaos. At the end of the 13th century, Anatolia was a shattered land, a patchwork of rival Turkish beyliks, broken crusader states, and fading Byzantine fortresses. The Mongols had swept across Asia like a storm, leaving kingdoms in ashes. In this world of shifting borders and endless war, a small tribe of frontier warriors settled near the town of Sagat. Their chieftain was a man named Osman I, son of Ertugrul. Osman was not a king, not yet. He ruled no more than a few thousand horsemen and farmers. Yet he carried a vision larger than any around him, a dream that his people could forge something greater, an empire guided by both faith and discipline. He began as many conquerors do, with opportunity. The Byzantine frontier was weak, its cities divided and exhausted. Osman led raids against their outposts, seizing villages, collecting tribute, and spreading his reputation. To his followers, victory was a sign of divine favor. To his enemies, he was the shadow at their gates. The poet Amidi later wrote, "Osman lit the torch of conquest. The world followed its flame. As word of his victories spread, neighboring tribes joined him." By the time of his death around 1326, Osman's son Orhan Gazi inherited not a clan, but a state, the first flame of empire. Orhan expanded his father's conquests westward. His most important victory came with the fall of Bursa, a prosperous Byzantine city. Bursa became the first true Ottoman capital, a symbol that the frontier warriors had become rulers. There, Orhan built mosques, schools, and markets, transforming a war camp into a city of trade and learning. The Ottomans introduced an idea that would define them for centuries: the balance between the sword and the pen. They were warriors, yes, but also administrators. They taxed fairly, protected local Christians and Jews, and welcomed skilled artisans regardless of faith. While Europe's crusader states were driven by fanaticism, the Ottomans built an empire on pragmatism. In 1354, an earthquake struck the Dardanelles, damaging the Byzantine fortress of Gallipoli. Ottoman soldiers moved in overnight, not as raiders but settlers. This was their first foothold in Europe, and it changed history forever. From that moment, the Ottoman horizon stretched beyond Asia Minor. They were no longer a Turkish power. They were becoming a Mediterranean empire. The age of expansion. By the late 14th century, the empire's momentum was unstoppable. Under Murad I and later Bayezid I, Ottoman armies marched through the Balkans, defeating Serbs, Bulgarians, and Hungarians. At the Battle of Kosovo, 1389, both kings fell, Murad slain by a Serbian assassin, and Serbia left in ruins. Bayezid I, called Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, ruled with ruthless energy. He besieged Constantinople itself and dreamed of uniting the entire Islamic world under his banner. Yet fate would humble him. In 1402, on the dusty plains of Ankara, Bayezid met the conqueror Tamerlane, a warlord whose armies had burned half of Asia. The Ottomans were crushed. Bayezid was captured and, legend says, kept in a golden cage. For 11 years, the empire nearly collapsed as his sons fought each other for the throne. But unlike so many kingdoms before, the Ottomans recovered. By 1413, Bayezid's son Mehmed I reunited the empire. He rebuilt the army, restored the treasury, and, most importantly, re-established the idea that the dynasty itself was sacred. The Ottoman star, dimmed but not extinguished, began to rise again. Faith and order. The 15th century saw a transformation not just of land, but of identity. The Ottomans no longer called themselves frontier raiders. They were guardians of Islamic civilization, heirs to both the caliphate and the legacy of Rome. They built institutions, a standing army known as the Janissaries, trained from childhood and loyal only to the Sultan. They created a bureaucracy that recorded every village, every tax, every man fit to serve. And at the center stood the Sultan, both political ruler and protector of faith. Under Murad II, the empire stabilized and grew rich through trade. Istanbul, still Constantinople, stood defiant, but surrounded. Its walls had endured for 1,000 years, but technology was changing the balance of power. The conquest of Constantinople. When Mehmed II, the 19-year-old son of Murad II, ascended the throne in 1451, few expected greatness. He was young, ambitious, and obsessed with one dream: to conquer Constantinople. For generations, Muslim rulers had tried and failed. Prophets had promised that one day a great commander would succeed. Mehmed believed that prophecy was his destiny. He spent 2 years preparing, building the Rumeli Hisar fortress to block the Bosporus, forging massive cannons to batter the city's walls. In April 1453, his army of nearly 80,000 men surrounded Constantinople. Inside, only 7,000 defenders stood under the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. For 53 days, the city resisted. Cannons thundered day and night, the sky filled with smoke. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans breached the walls. The emperor fought until he vanished beneath the tide of battle. By evening, Mehmed rode through the shattered gates. He entered the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and bowed in prayer. The greatest city in the Christian world had become the capital of Islam. Constantinople was dead. Istanbul was born. The world changed that day. Trade routes, cultures, and religions realigned. Europe trembled. The Middle East rejoiced. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a frontier state. It was the heart of a new world. The Golden City. Mehmed the Conqueror was not merely a warrior. He was a visionary. He rebuilt Istanbul with architects, scholars, and merchants from across the world. Churches became mosques, but art and learning thrived. He opened schools of astronomy, medicine, and law. He collected manuscripts in Greek, Arabic, Persian, and Latin. Under his rule, the empire became a magnet for genius, a place where East and West exchanged ideas instead of arrows. Yet his ambitions reached beyond civilization. He dreamed of universal empire. He marched into the Balkans, captured Bosnia, Serbia, and Trebizond, and extended Ottoman influence deep into the Black Sea. He even launched fleets into Italy, and though they failed, the message was clear: no corner of the known world was beyond his reach. When Mehmed II died in 1481, he left behind not just a vast empire, but a system strong enough to outlive him. Between two worlds, his son, Bayezid II, ruled in contrast, cautious, spiritual, and diplomatic. He welcomed Jewish refugees fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, saying, "They call Ferdinand a wise king, yet he impoverishes his realm and enriches mine." Istanbul flourished as a cosmopolitan capital, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish quarters coexisting under Ottoman law. Bayezid focused on stability, but his reign also revealed a growing truth. The empire's expansion had slowed, and new challenges were rising from within. In 1512, power passed to Selim I, known as Selim the Grim. Fierce and uncompromising, Selim saw himself as the sword of Islam. He crushed rivals, executed rebellious governors, and reshaped the empire into a war machine once again. He looked east toward Persia, where the Safavid Empire threatened to spread Shia Islam across the Sunni world. At Caldron, 1514, Selim's cannons shattered the Safavid army. Then he turned south, toward the Arab heartlands. By 1517, Selim's armies had conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, ending the Mamluk Sultanate. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina came under Ottoman protection, and with them the title of Caliph. For the first time in centuries, the spiritual and temporal leadership of the Islamic world were united. The Ottomans now ruled not just land, but legacy. A new dawn, Suleiman the Magnificent. When Selim I died in 1520, his son Suleiman inherited an empire stretching across 3 continents. The young sultan would become the most celebrated ruler in Ottoman history, Suleiman the Magnificent to the west, and Kanuni, the lawgiver, to his own people. Under Suleiman, the empire would reach its golden age, a realm of poetry and conquest, justice and ambition. But even as the sun rose higher, its light began to cast the first long shadows of decline. And that is where the next chapter begins. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the height of power and hidden weakness, 1520 to 1606. The sun had risen over an empire that seemed eternal. When Suleiman I became sultan in 1520, the Ottoman world stretched farther than any ruler before him had ever dreamed. From the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Hungary, from the Persian frontier to the gates of Vienna, the empire's banners rippled in every wind. Istanbul stood at its heart, a shining city of domes and minarets, straddling two continents like a bridge between faiths, worlds, and destinies. People called him Suleiman the Magnificent. But to his people he was Kanuni the lawgiver. He ruled not only by sword, but by pen, shaping laws that would outlive him for centuries. The Age of Glory. Suleiman's first years were a blaze of conquest. In 1521 he captured Belgrade, the fortress Europe once believed impenetrable. In 1522 he sailed across the Mediterranean to crush the Knights of Rhodes, the last Crusader outpost in the east. And in 1526 came his greatest victory, the Battle of Mohacs. On a rain-soaked Hungarian plain, 20,000 Ottoman cannons and muskets shattered the Christian armies. The young Hungarian king was found drowned in a swamp, his crown sinking with him. In one afternoon, the medieval kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist. The road to Vienna lay open. Europe trembled. Rumors spread that the crescent would soon rise above the cathedrals of the West. When the Ottoman army finally reached Vienna's walls in 1529, the world held its breath. But winter came early, mud swallowed the artillery, and snow choked the roads. Suleiman withdrew, leaving behind both devastation and myth, the moment Europe realized how close it had come to conquest. Even in retreat, the empire's image was unstoppable. Venetian diplomats wrote, "The Grand Turk is Lord of Lords. No power on earth equals his." The Ottoman Empire stood as the superpower of its age and Suleiman its flawless center. The order of the world. Power, however, meant more than war. Suleiman saw himself as the guardian of justice, a king who must balance divine law with human reason. He recodified centuries of scattered decrees into a single, coherent system, the canon. He appointed judges in every province, scholars who interpreted both Sharia and civil law. Merchants from Venice and Cairo traded under imperial protection. Farmers, Christians, and Jews could petition the Sultan directly. Even the lowest soldier could demand fairness if wronged by a governor. In a world of tyranny, such justice made the empire seem enlightened. Travelers compared Istanbul to Rome at its height, a city where markets never slept and languages mixed like the sea currents below its bridges. In the palace, the Topkapi Seraglio, the Sultan presided over an empire of order, until love and intrigue began to twist that order into something more dangerous. The shadow of the harem. At the center of Suleiman's private world was a woman history would never forget. Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, a red-haired concubine from the steppes of Ukraine. She rose from slavery to become the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. Suleiman fell deeply in love with her, so much so that he broke centuries of royal tradition and married her. Roxolana's influence was magnetic but divisive. She corresponded with foreign rulers, advised the Sultan on state matters, and maneuvered to secure her own son's succession. For the first time, the politics of the harem, the hidden world of women, entered the affairs of empire. And though the Ottoman court remained formidable, whispers began to spread. The empire is ruled not by the Sultan, but by his beloved. In this era of gold, the first hairline fractures appeared, cracks born not of weakness, but of power itself. Art, law, and faith. Yet even as palace intrigue deepened, Suleiman's reign produced one of the greatest cultural flowerings in human history. The architect Mimar Sinan, once a Christian boy taken through the Difsum system, built more than 300 monuments. Mosques, bridges, aqueducts, each a fusion of engineering and poetry. His masterpiece, the Süleymanî Mosque, crowned Istanbul's skyline like a mountain of marble and light. Scholars in the palace compiled maps of the known world, measuring the stars and seas. Poets compared Suleiman to Solomon, Alexander, and Caesar. The empire had become the beating heart of 3 continents, the wealth of India, the grain of Egypt, and the silver of the Balkans all flowing into one treasury. Yet history is cruel. The higher the empire climbed, the more perilous the fall would become. The turning of the tide. In 1566, after 46 years of rule, Suleiman led his final campaign against Hungary. Old, sick, and carried on a litter, he refused to die in bed. As cannons fired at the fortress of Sijitvar, he whispered prayers of victory, and in the night he passed away. His death was kept secret until the battle ended in triumph. The Sultan's body was brought home in silence, his heart buried beneath the fortress walls. Suleiman's reign marked the zenith of the Ottoman world. But the empire that seemed eternal had begun to age. Sultans in shadow. His son Selim II, nicknamed Selim the Sot, inherited his father's throne but not his discipline. He preferred wine to war, music to administration. Government gradually fell into the hands of grand viziers and palace officials. The first of these was Sokalu Mehmed Pasha, a man of genius who kept the empire running with near-superhuman efficiency. Under his guidance, the Ottoman navy dominated the Mediterranean, capturing Cyprus from Venice in 1571. But that same year brought disaster. At Lepanto, a coalition of Christian navies destroyed the Ottoman fleet in one of history's greatest sea battles. 30,000 sailors perished. The empire built a new navy within a year, yet its aura of invincibility was gone. The world was changing again, and not in the Ottomans' favor. The world shifts west. Far from Istanbul, European powers began to look beyond the Mediterranean. Spanish and Portuguese ships sailed across the Atlantic, opening sea routes to India and the Americas. Trade that once passed through Ottoman lands now bypassed them entirely. Gold and silver flowed into Europe. The empire's coffers grew hollow. The Ottomans still controlled the crossroads of the Old World, but the center of gravity had moved. They were rulers of a map that was shrinking. To maintain wealth, taxes rose. To maintain armies, corruption spread. Local governors grew rich while peasants starved. And at the court, the succession system, where every prince could claim the throne, turned brother against brother in bloody civil wars. The Divserm, once a source of loyal janissaries, became a breeding ground for privilege. Positions were bought and sold. The soldiers who once defined discipline now demanded bribes and power. The empire was still magnificent on the surface, but beneath the gold, rot was setting in. Faith and doubt. In the 17th century, the Ottomans faced a crisis of identity. The empire that once embodied confidence and unity now wrestled with doubt. The ulama, the religious scholars, argued over whether adopting European sciences was heresy or necessity. Printing presses, telescopes, and clocks were banned or restricted. As Europe entered the scientific revolution, the Ottomans withdrew into tradition. Some historians call this period the beginning of decline. Others, the age of survival. The truth lies somewhere in between. While the empire struggled, it also endured. Its cities remained vibrant. Its laws still worked. And its armies, though no longer unstoppable, continued to fight on every frontier. The battle for Europe. In 1593, a new war erupted with the Habsburgs, a conflict that would drag on for 13 years. The empire won some battles, lost others. When peace was finally signed at Zitvatorok in 1606, it marked a symbolic shift. For the first time, the Ottoman Sultan acknowledged the Habsburg Emperor as his equal. It was a small sentence in a long treaty, but it changed everything. The age of dominance was over. From now on, the Ottomans would have to share the world stage. The hidden weakness. Outwardly, the empire still seemed strong. The cities bustled with trade. Its armies stretched from Africa to Persia. But the delicate balance that had sustained Ottoman greatness, between center and province, faith and reason, sword and pen, was fracturing. Corruption seeped into the provinces. Local warlords collected their own taxes, defying Istanbul. Peasant revolts flared across Anatolia, the Salali rebellions, driven by hunger and injustice. Janissaries, once protectors of order, now joined the chaos. Within a century of Suleiman's death, the empire had transformed from a disciplined machine into a vast but weary organism. Strong enough to survive, too heavy to move. Yet even then, it endured because the Ottomans possessed a remarkable ability to adapt. Whenever they fell, they learned just enough to rise again. The mirage of invincibility. Foreign travelers visiting Istanbul around 1600 described a city of breathtaking contrasts. Gleaming mosques beside crumbling palaces, scholars debating philosophy while janissaries brawled in the streets. To some, it seemed paradise. To others, decay disguised as splendor. But to the common people, the merchant in the bazaar, the farmer along the Tigris, the sailor in Alexandria, the empire still meant stability. Even weakened, it provided roads, markets, and justice in a world of chaos. It was still better to live under the Sultan's law than under anyone else's uncertainty. That belief, the faith in the empire's order, would keep it alive for centuries more. Echoes of greatness. By 1606, the Ottoman Empire was no longer expanding. It had reached its natural limits. But its culture, art, and architecture still radiated beauty. Every mosque dome was a memory of conquest. Every law, a fragment of Suleiman's dream. Yet the world outside its borders was changing faster than anyone in Istanbul could imagine. Europe was entering the age of exploration, capitalism, and enlightenment. The Ottomans were entering the age of resistance, fighting not just enemies, but time itself. For now, the empire stood tall, a giant of history bathed in the light of sunset, unaware of how close the darkness had crept. Empires rarely notice the moment they begin to fall. For the Ottomans, it started not with defeat, but with satisfaction. And as the 17th century dawned, the greatest empire of the Old World began its slow march toward the abyss. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the decline and the reforms, 1606 to 1839. The guns that once thundered across continents now rusted in their fortresses. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire had survived wars, plagues, and revolts. But it had lost something far more dangerous than territory: momentum. For 3 centuries, the Ottomans had marched forward, carried by faith, discipline, and purpose. Now, for the first time, they stood still. And in history, standing still is another form of falling. A fragile peace. After the Treaty of Zitvatorok in 1606, the Sultan was no longer the unquestioned master of Europe. The empire still stretched from Algiers to Baghdad, but its heart was uneasy. The provinces that once sent gold and grain to Istanbul now withheld taxes. Janissary soldiers who had once guarded the throne rioted in the streets, demanding pay. In Anatolia, the countryside burned. Bands of desperate peasants and disillusioned soldiers roamed from village to village, looting and killing. They were called the Salali rebels, named after a preacher who had first risen against corrupt officials. For decades, rebellion flickered like wildfire across the empire's core. The Ottomans crushed each uprising, but victory brought no healing. Every revolt drained the treasury and deepened distrust between ruler and ruled. Palace intrigues. Inside the Topkapi Palace, the empire's decline took on a quieter, more poisonous shape. The harem, once a sanctuary of royal lineage, became the empire's hidden government. During the so-called Sultanate of Women, 1570 to 1650, powerful mothers and concubines ruled behind the curtain. Some, like Kozum Sultan, were brilliant strategists who kept the realm intact when child sultans sat on the throne. Others manipulated power for survival, pitting viziers and generals against one another. The court turned inward. Instead of conquering new lands, the sultans battled rumors, assassins, and their own families. Brothers strangled brothers to secure succession. Bloodlines thinned, courage faded, and ceremony replaced purpose. Yet the illusion of grandeur persisted. Visitors still saw gold domes, silk robes, and disciplined guards. But the empire's mind was tired, its energy consumed by its own reflection. Wars on every front. While the palace drifted, its enemies advanced. Persia tested the eastern borders. Venice and Austria probed the west. In 1683, the Ottomans made one last bid for glory. Under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a massive army, over 100,000 strong, marched on Vienna, the same city Suleiman had failed to capture a century earlier. For 2 months they besieged its walls, confident that Europe would kneel once more. Then, on September 12, 1683, the tide turned. A coalition of European forces led by King John III Sobieski of Poland launched a surprise attack. By nightfall, the Ottoman camp was in flames. Kara Mustafa fled and was later executed by the Sultan's own order. The defeat at Vienna was more than military. It was psychological. It marked the moment the empire stopped expanding, and Europe began to strike back. Over the next 16 years, the Great Turkish War shattered Ottoman power in Europe. Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans were lost. In 1699, the empire signed the Treaty of Karlowitz, ceding lands for the first time in its history. It was a humiliation no sultan could ignore. The conquerors of Constantinople were now defenders of what remained. The long decline, the 18th century dawned on a weary empire. Sultans came and went, each promising renewal, each leaving the same old decay. Ahmed III tried to embrace peace and pleasure. He filled Istanbul with gardens, fountains, and music, an era known as the Tulip Age. The capital glittered, but beyond its walls, poverty deepened. Europe was inventing machines, the Ottomans were planting tulips. Still, even beauty can buy time. The empire found brief prosperity through trade and diplomacy. Ottoman ambassadors visited Paris and Vienna, returning with tales of Western science and art. Some began to whisper that the empire must learn from Europe or perish. Those whispers grew louder. The age of reform and resistance. By 1730, reform was no longer optional. But when Ahmed III tried to modernize the army and taxes, the Janissaries revolted. Riots consumed the city. The Sultan was forced to abdicate. His successor, Mahmud I, ruled cautiously, a realist in an empire addicted to nostalgia. He rebuilt fortresses, reorganized troops, and imported foreign advisors. Yet every reform sparked backlash. To change too quickly risked rebellion. To change too slowly guaranteed decline. That delicate balancing act would define Ottoman politics for the next century. The empire under pressure. By the mid-1700s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the center of the world. Russia under Catherine the Great had become its most dangerous rival. Russian armies swept through Crimea and the Black Sea, capturing fortresses that had guarded the empire for centuries. The 1774 Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka forced the Ottomans to grant independence to Crimea and give Russia the right to protect Orthodox Christians inside Ottoman lands. For the first time, a foreign power had gained the legal right to interfere in the empire's internal affairs. It was a polite form of conquest, colonization through treaties instead of battles. Meanwhile, the empire's own provinces were slipping away. In Egypt, local rulers known as Mamluks regained power. In Arabia, the Wahhabi movement rose, calling for religious purification and rebellion against Ottoman authority. In the Balkans, nationalism stirred beneath centuries of silence. The empire's enemies no longer came only from outside. They were growing within. The illusion of control. Sultans still ruled from Istanbul's marble palaces, issuing firmans stamped with golden seals. But many of those orders went ignored. Governors acted like kings, tax collectors like thieves. Communication across such vast lands was slow, and loyalty thin. The empire became a quilt, beautiful from afar, frayed up close. The only thread keeping it together was Islam, and even that unity was fading under modern pressures. In the 1780s, Selim III, a thoughtful and reform-minded prince, ascended the throne. He understood that the empire could not survive with medieval institutions. Europe had industrialized. The Ottomans were still relying on swords and paper scrolls. Selim began what he called the Nizam-i-Sedid, the New Order. He created a modern army trained in European tactics, built new schools, and sent envoys to study Western science. For a moment, hope returned. Istanbul buzzed with talk of rebirth. But change has enemies. The Janissaries, terrified of losing privilege, saw the new order as betrayal. Conservative clerics called it heresy. In 1807, they revolted, stormed the palace, and murdered Selim III. The reformer's dream ended in his own blood. Revolt and rebirth. Amid the chaos, a new leader emerged, Mahmud II. He was patient, ruthless, and determined to finish what Selim had begun. For decades, he pretended submission to the Janissaries while secretly preparing their destruction. In 1826, he struck. At dawn, the imperial cannon roared. Palace troops and artillery surrounded the Janissary barracks and set them ablaze. Thousands were killed in what became known as the Auspicious Incident. With one act, Mahmud II erased an institution that had existed for 400 years. The empire could now rebuild without its most toxic legacy. Mahmud modernized the army, established ministries, introduced Western-style uniforms, and even ordered officials to shave their traditional beards, a symbolic break from the past. He opened new schools that taught engineering and medicine, translating European textbooks into Ottoman Turkish. The empire began to breathe again, cautiously, painfully. But modernization came at a price: identity. To survive, the Ottomans had to become more like the very Europe that had humiliated them. And many, especially in the provinces, saw that as betrayal. The world shrinks. While Mahmud fought internal decay, the world around him changed faster than ever. Steamships appeared in the Mediterranean. Telegraphs connected London to India. Factories in Manchester produced in a week what entire Ottoman provinces could not make in a year. The empire's economy, once rich from trade routes, now depended on European imports and loans. Textile workshops in Bursa closed as cheap British cloth flooded the markets. Merchants who had once paid taxes to the Sultan now owed debts to Parisian bankers. Europe called it globalization. For the Ottomans, it was slow suffocation. The Greek Revolution. In 1821, the empire faced a new and deadly threat, the first successful nationalist revolt within its borders. The Greeks rose in rebellion, inspired by Western liberal ideas and backed by European sympathizers. For years, Ottoman armies fought brutal campaigns to suppress them, but public opinion in Europe turned against the empire. When Ottoman forces massacred civilians at Chios, European newspapers printed the images in horror. Poets like Byron and Shelley turned the Greek struggle into a cause célèbre. Britain, France, and Russia eventually intervened militarily, destroying the Ottoman fleet at Navarino in 1827. By 1830, Greece was independent. It was the first domino in a chain that would shatter the empire piece by piece. The rise of Egypt. Even as the Greeks broke away, another danger emerged from within: the ambitious Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali Pasha. A former Albanian soldier, Muhammad Ali modernized Egypt's army, economy, and education system. He dreamed of replacing the Ottomans entirely. In 1831, his forces invaded Syria, defeating imperial armies again and again. By 1833, he threatened to march on Istanbul itself. Desperate, Sultan Mahmud II begged for help, and the empire's ancient rival, Russia, answered. Russian troops landed near the capital, saving the Ottomans but humiliating them further. To repay the favor, Mahmud signed the Treaty of Hunker-Iskalisi, giving Russia influence over the straits between the Black Sea and Mediterranean. It was protection at the price of sovereignty. Once the masters of Europe, the Ottomans had become its client. The prelude to Tanzimat. When Mahmud II died in 1839, the empire was exhausted but not lifeless. He left behind a reformed army, a modernized administration, and, most importantly, a new generation of leaders who believed that the empire could be reborn through law and equality. Within months of his death, his young son Abdulmecid I issued a royal decree promising justice for all subjects, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, and equal rights before the law. This proclamation, known as the Hat-I Serif of Gulhane, marked the beginning of the Tanzimat era, the Ottoman Empire's last and greatest experiment with modernity. The world had entered the 19th century, an age of steam, nationalism, and empire. The Ottomans, once conquerors, were now survivors. And though their hearts still beat, it did so under the weight of history, debt, and a destiny they could no longer control. For 6 centuries, they had ruled the crossroads of the world. Now they stood at another crossroads, between past and future, faith and reform, survival and surrender. The final chapters of their story would test every idea they had ever lived by. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, 1839 to 1918. The Ottoman Empire entered the 19th century with trembling hands but an unbroken crown. It had survived rebellion, invasion, and humiliation. Yet still it stood, scarred but alive. The world around it, however, had changed beyond recognition. Europe was no longer a patchwork of kingdoms. It was a machine of nations, industrial, scientific, restless. Steamships churned the seas where galleys once sailed. Telegraph lines whispered across continents. And in this new world of speed and steel, the Ottomans appeared ancient, a relic moving through history at the pace of a camel caravan. The dream of Tanzimat. When Sultan Abdülmecid I ascended the throne in 1839, he was barely 16, young, idealistic, and determined to save his dying empire through reason instead of war. That same year, he issued a royal decree at the Gulhane Park in Istanbul, a document that would become known as the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. For the first time in Ottoman history, the state promised equality before the law for all citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Taxes were to be fair, conscription regulated, property rights protected. It was a revolution written not with swords, but with ink. European ambassadors applauded. Intellectuals rejoiced. Even Christian subjects in the Balkans dared to hope that justice might finally reach them. Yet beneath the applause, resistance simmered. Many Muslim officials saw the reforms as betrayal, a surrender to the West. They asked, "What is left of the caliphate if the infidel is our equal?" Abdülmecid pressed on anyway. Railways, postal services, and Western-style schools appeared. Young Ottomans were sent to study in Paris and London. French became the language of diplomacy. For a fleeting moment, the empire seemed reborn, elegant, modern, and optimistic. But hope, like empire, is fragile. Strings of Europe. With reform came debt. To build railroads and modern navies, the sultans borrowed millions from European banks. London and Paris became the empire's creditors, and, in truth, its masters. By the 1870s, the Ottoman treasury owed more money than it could ever repay. European advisors controlled customs, tariffs, and even the collection of taxes. What had once been a sovereign state was now an economy on foreign life support. Behind polite diplomacy, Europe's appetite grew bolder. Britain eyed Egypt and the Suez. Russia dreamed of the Bosporus and Constantinople. France coveted North Africa. They no longer feared the empire, they were preparing to divide it. Fire in the Balkans. While the capital obsessed over reform and fashion, its Balkan provinces boiled with rebellion. The people of Serbia, Bulgaria, and Bosnia, inspired by nationalism and backed by Russia, began to rise. Church bells and rifle fire echoed through the mountains. In 1876, the uprising in Bulgaria was crushed with horrifying brutality. Entire villages burned. Thousands died. European newspapers called it the Bulgarian horrors. Public outrage swept Britain and France. Statesmen who once praised the Tanzimat now condemned the empire as barbaric. The same powers that demanded reform now used the reformers' failures to justify intervention. Russia seized its chance. Declaring itself protector of Slavs and Orthodox Christians, it invaded Ottoman territory in 1877. The war was brutal and swift. By the spring of 1878, Russian troops were within sight of Istanbul. The Ottoman army, outnumbered and exhausted, was forced to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of San Stefano stripped the empire of nearly all its European lands. A massive new Bulgaria, under Russian influence, emerged from its ashes. But Britain and Austria, fearful of Russian dominance, forced revisions at the Congress of Berlin later that year. The empire regained fragments of territory, but the damage was done. The map of the Balkans, once painted Ottoman green, was now a mosaic of independent nations. For the first time since the Middle Ages, the empire had ceased to be a European power. The Sultan and the Shadow. Amid this turmoil rose a man who would rule longer and darker than any before him, Sultan Abdülhamid II. When he took the throne in 1876, he inherited not an empire, but a storm. Parliament had just been created under Western pressure, but Abdülhamid dissolved it within 2 years, declaring that freedom had made the state weak. He ruled through fear and surveillance, the panopticon of the Sublime Porte. Spies filled every coffeehouse. Letters were opened, editors jailed, thinkers exiled. Yet Abdulhamid also saw clearly what few others could. Europe would never allow the empire to reform on its own terms. So he turned eastward. He revived the old title of Caliph, presenting himself as the leader of all Muslims, from Morocco to India. It was political genius. When Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, Abdulhamid used pan-Islamic rhetoric to rally Muslims against colonialism. In distant lands, people prayed for the sultan they would never meet. But loyalty born of faith could not rebuild an empty treasury. And modernity born of fear could not last forever. The twilight of control. By the turn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire resembled a patient kept alive by foreign doctors. Railways and factories existed, but under foreign ownership. Ports bustled, but profits sailed to London and Marseilles. In Arabia, tribal revolts flared. In Macedonia and Crete, Christians demanded autonomy. Even within the Turkish heartland, whispers spread that the empire was cursed, that the Padishah had lost God's favor. Then came the Young Turks, a secret generation of officers and intellectuals educated in Europe, inspired by liberty and furious at despotism. They met in salons and barracks, plotting revolution. In 1908, their movement erupted. Troops marched on Istanbul demanding a constitution. Abdulhamid was forced to restore parliament. For the first time in 30 years, the empire spoke openly again. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Newspapers printed without censorship. The empire seemed alive with energy. But freedom, like empire, is hard to control. Within a year, rival factions of liberals, nationalists, and clerics turned on one another. The dream of unity fractured into ideology and chaos. The Balkan disaster. Between 1911 and 1913, a chain of wars struck the empire like hammer blows. First came the Italo-Turkish War, in which Italy seized Libya, the empire's last African province. Then the First Balkan War erupted, as former Ottoman subjects, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, united against their old master. The Ottomans, divided and unprepared, collapsed in weeks. From the Adriatic to the Aegean, the empire's centuries-old rule vanished almost overnight. More than 500,000 Muslims fled as refugees, their villages burned, their lives uprooted. One observer wrote, "The Turks lost not only their lands, but their confidence. The empire died in their hearts before it died on the map." In 1913, a coup brought the Committee of Union and Progress, led by Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, men known collectively as the Three Pashas, to power. They promised to save what remained through nationalism and militarization. But nationalism, once used by Europe to destroy the empire, would now devour it from within. The Great War. When the guns of August 1914 erupted across Europe, the Ottoman Empire hesitated. It was weak, indebted, and surrounded by stronger powers. But the Three Pashas saw war as opportunity. If Germany triumphed, they believed, the empire could regain its lost lands and prestige. So, on October 29th, Ottoman warships bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea. Within days, the empire was at war with the allies Britain, France, and Russia. The First World War would become its last. At Gallipoli, Ottoman soldiers under Mustafa Kemal, a young colonel from Salonika, achieved immortal fame by repelling an Allied invasion in 1915. It was a rare and brilliant victory, bought with unimaginable blood. Yet elsewhere, the empire disintegrated. British forces captured Basra and Baghdad. In Arabia, Sharif Hussein bin Ali launched the Arab Revolt, encouraged by British promises of independence. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, rode alongside a young British officer, T.A. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia. Arabs, long ruled from Istanbul, now turned their guns on it. Trains were blown up, supply lines cut, cities lost one after another. The Ottoman heartland starved. Blockades strangled trade. Famine swept Syria and Lebanon. In the shadows of war, dark decisions were made. Forced deportations of Armenians that would leave an unhealed scar in history. By 1917, The empire was collapsing from within. Revolts, hunger, and despair consumed it. The fall. In 1918, after 4 years of catastrophic war, the Ottoman armies were broken. British troops entered Damascus and Jerusalem. The once mighty empire signed the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, surrendering unconditionally. The Sultan still sat on his throne, but he ruled nothing. Allied warships anchored in the Bosporus. Foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of Istanbul, the same city Mehmed the Conqueror had taken in glory 465 years earlier. In Paris, diplomats carved the Ottoman corpse into pieces. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, once secret, became reality. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. Greece claimed the Aegean coast. Italy eyed Anatolia. Even the capital itself was marked for partition. The sick man of Europe was now clinically dead. The embers of resistance. Yet in defeat, something unexpected stirred. In Anatolia, small groups of officers refused to surrender. Among them was the hero of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal Pasha. He saw the empire's fall not as an end, but as a beginning. Under his leadership, Turkish nationalists gathered in Ankara, declaring that sovereignty belonged to the people, not to foreign powers or a powerless sultan. Between 1919 and 1922, they fought a desperate war of independence against Greeks, Armenians, and occupying Allied troops. When the dust settled, the Republic was born. On November 17, 1922, Sultan Mehmed VI boarded a British warship and sailed into exile. No cannons fired, no crowds wept. 600 years of empire ended in silence. The caliphate itself would be abolished 2 years later. The old world was gone. Epilogue, the price of survival. The Ottoman Empire, once feared and envied, had survived longer than any of its rivals. Rome had fallen. Spain's empire had vanished. Britain's would fade in a century. But the Ottomans, through faith, adaptability, and sheer endurance, lasted 623 years. Their collapse reshaped everything that came after. The borders of the modern Middle East, the rise of secular Turkey, the birth of Arab nationalism, the seeds of conflicts that still burn today. They called the empire the sick man of Europe, but few remember that even on its deathbed, it refused to die quietly. Empires do not die of age. They die of pride. The Ottomans believed they were chosen by heaven, and for centuries they were. But history is a harsher judge than faith, and when it demands change, even the greatest must kneel. The smoke over the Bosporus cleared. The flag of a new republic rose where an empire had fallen. And the echoes of the old call to prayer drifted across the city one last time. Soft, defiant, eternal. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the legacy, 1918 modern era. The guns of the Great War had fallen silent. Across Europe, the world mourned its dead. But in the East, an entire civilization was breathing its last. The Ottoman Empire, which for 6 centuries had ruled the crossroads of humanity, now existed only as memory and ruin. Istanbul lay under foreign occupation. Allied soldiers patrolled its docks. French and British flags fluttered over its palaces. In cafes once filled with poets and scholars, officers in foreign uniforms drank coffee under chandeliers that once belonged to sultans. The empire's heart had stopped beating, but the echo still lingered. In its art, its faith, its language, and in the millions who had called themselves Ottoman. From empire to republic. In the Anatolian hills, a different story was being written. While diplomats in Paris divided the empire's remains, Turkish patriots were gathering beneath a new banner. They were led by a soldier who refused to surrender, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, the hero of Gallipoli. In 1919, he stood before a small crowd in the city of Samsun and declared, "The nation's independence will be saved by the determination of its own sons." Those words became a flame. Farmers, teachers, and veterans united behind him. They fought not for empire but for survival, for the right to live free on their own land. The Turkish War of Independence raged for 3 years. Against Greek armies backed by Europe, against Allied forces who sought to partition Anatolia, they held their ground. By 1922, They had achieved the impossible, driving out every foreign invader. That November, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British warship and sailed into exile. He left behind an empty throne and 6 centuries of history. 2 years later, the caliphate itself was abolished. In its place rose a new nation, the Republic of Turkey, proclaimed on October 29, 1923. Its capital would not be the ancient imperial Istanbul but Ankara, a symbol of rebirth, of simplicity, of a people starting over. The age of Ataturk. Mustafa Kemal took a new name, Ataturk, father of the Turks. He vowed that his country would never again bow to foreign powers or to superstition. He abolished the Sultanate, replaced Islamic law with civil codes, banned the fez, and adopted the Latin alphabet. Women gained the right to vote. Schools became secular. Factories replaced feudal estates. In a single generation, Turkey leapt from medieval to modern. For the first time in centuries, it was no longer an empire, but it was finally independent. The transformation was breathtaking, but painful. Millions who had grown up believing the Sultan was God's shadow on earth now lived in a republic that rejected divine rule altogether. Mosques that once echoed with sermons of empire now heard the call to prayer in a new language. The past had not vanished, but it had been buried under concrete and reform. Ataturk's revolution ensured Turkey's survival, yet it also marked the final separation from the Ottoman soul. The empire was dead. The nation was born. The ghosts of the empire. Outside Turkey's new borders, the empire's ghost continued to shape the world. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, drawn by British and French diplomats with a ruler and a pen, had divided the Middle East into artificial nations. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, all carved from Ottoman provinces that had once been connected by culture and trade. Those borders, drawn in smoke-filled rooms a century ago, still bleed today. In Iraq, rival sects once united under Ottoman law turned on each other. In Syria, European mandates planted seeds of dictatorship and civil war. In Palestine, promises made to Jews and Arabs alike ignited a conflict that endures. Every headline from the modern Middle East carries the faint echo of that old imperial collapse. The world did not move on from the Ottoman Empire. It still lives inside its consequences. Faith without empire. For the Muslim world, the fall of the Ottomans was more than political, it was spiritual. For centuries, the caliphate had symbolized unity. Even when its power waned, it offered the idea that all believers shared a single destiny. When it vanished in 1924, that idea collapsed with it. No single authority replaced the caliph. Every nation followed its own path. Islam splintered into states and movements, each claiming to carry the true legacy. Some mourned the caliphate as a lost golden age. Others celebrated its end as liberation from tyranny. But the vacuum it left has haunted the modern era. A longing for unity that never returned. The empire's mosques became museums. Its palaces, archives. Its memory, a battlefield of interpretation. The inheritance of empire. What, then, did the world inherit from the Ottomans? From the ashes of their rule rose 30 modern nations. Their roads became the foundations of highways. Their legal codes evolved into those of half the Middle East and the Balkans. Their architecture, domes, arches, courtyards, still define skylines from Sarajevo to Cairo. Their cuisine, their music, their poetry, their tolerance of diversity, all survive in fragments. Yet perhaps their greatest legacy is a warning. The Ottomans ruled by adapting. They survived crusades, Mongols, and industrial revolutions. But when they stopped adapting, when they turned inward, proud of the past and blind to the future, the world overtook them. Every power since has repeated the same mistake in different forms. History doesn't repeat itself. It whispers. And the whisper that comes from the Bosporus says, "Change or be changed." The Western memory. In the West, the Ottoman Empire remains a paradox, at once romantic and feared. Painters of the 19th century depicted its harems and palaces as exotic fantasies. Novelists portrayed it as the dark mirror of Europe, sensual, dangerous, decaying. Few remembered its libraries, its tolerance, or its diplomacy. In Western imagination, The empire became the other, the mysterious East that both fascinated and frightened. But the reality was always more complex. The Ottomans were Europeans, Asians, and Africans at once. They built bridges where others built walls. Their ambassadors spoke half a dozen languages. Their cities welcomed Jews expelled from Christian kingdoms. They were not just conquerors, they were connectors. Today, historians are rediscovering that truth. The Ottoman Empire was not the shadow of Europe, but its reflection. The Turkish Renaissance. As the 20th century unfolded, Turkey found itself walking a tightrope between memory and modernity. Ataturk's reforms turned it toward the West, but the pull of the East never disappeared. During World War II, Turkey remained neutral, cautious of another collapse. After 1945, it joined NATO, guarding Europe's southeastern flank against Soviet expansion. In the decades that followed, it transformed from a war-torn land into a modern industrial state. Istanbul once again became a global city, not the capital of empire, but the meeting point of continents. Skyscrapers rose beside mosques, smartphones beside calligraphy, jazz beside the call to prayer. The spirit of the empire had changed form, not vanished. The same river still flowed, only the name had changed. Echoes across the Middle East. Elsewhere, the Ottoman absence left wounds that never fully healed. In Egypt, nationalism overthrew British rule but also erased centuries of shared Ottoman heritage. In Syria and Iraq, military coups and dictators filled the vacuum once balanced by imperial bureaucracy. In Palestine, colonial promises clashed with faith and displacement. In the Balkans, Ottoman mosques and bridges still stand, sometimes revered, sometimes reviled. The world that rose after the empire's fall was not more peaceful. It was simply less ordered. Where once one government united dozens of cultures, now dozens of governments fought to define who they were. The Ottomans had ruled through a delicate equilibrium between religion and pragmatism, diversity and discipline. When that balance died, so did stability. The lessons of the crescent and the crown. The story of the Ottoman Empire is the story of humanity itself. How power rises, matures, and decays. It teaches that empire is not just conquest, but compromise. That tolerance is strength and arrogance poison. That the walls of any great city, no matter how high, cannot keep out time. For 6 centuries, the Ottomans believed they were chosen by fate. Perhaps they were. But fate, like empire, demands constant renewal. When renewal stopped, destiny moved on. And yet, even in defeat, they achieved something remarkable. They endured long enough to hand their world to the modern age intact. The Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa, their languages, their cuisines, their maps, all still carry the Ottoman fingerprint. To study them is to study us, because the line between past and present is not a wall. It is a mirror, the final reflection. Today, as the call to prayer rises over Istanbul's skyline, it echoes between glass towers and 600-year-old minarets. Ferries cross the Bosporus where once imperial galleys rode. Tourists walk through Topkapi Palace, taking photos where sultans once held councils that decided the fate of nations. Few stop to realize that this is not just history, it is continuity. An empire may die, but civilization does not. The Ottoman Empire was not a chapter of the past. It was the prologue to the modern world. This fall closed one story, only to open 1,000 more. The empire is gone, but its shadow moves still. In languages spoken, in music sung, in borders drawn, in faith kept. It reminds us that nothing built by human hands lasts forever, yet nothing truly ends while memory remains. The Bosporus gleams under the setting sun. The muezzin's voice drifts across the water, weaving through the noise of traffic and the hum of modern life. It is neither ancient nor modern, it is both. And in that sound, the past unfolded, still whispers. Empires fall. Civilizations evolve. Memory endures. Studio microphone, The Fall of the Ottoman Empire, echoes through time. 1923, the present age. The empire was gone, but its shadow never left. In 1923, as the Republic of Turkey took its first fragile steps into modernity, The Ottoman world seemed buried beneath history's dust. Yet the truth was different. Empires do not die. They dissolve into memory, language, faith, into the quiet habits of millions who still walk through their ruins without realizing they live inside their echoes. The last breath of an empire. When the sultans fell, they did not vanish. Their descendants scattered to Cairo, Beirut, London, and Mecca. Some lived as exiles in small apartments, clutching faded family crests that once ruled 3 continents. Others tried to forget. In Istanbul, the palaces of Dolmabahce and Topkapi became museums. The marble floors still whispered under the feet of visitors, as if remembering the weight of vanished power. The royal tugboats that once carried ambassadors now ferried schoolchildren across the Bosporus. But in the quiet corners of the city, in the scent of coffee, the call of the muezzin, the poetry recited in tea houses, the empire breathed still. A new world, old roots. The 20th century roared forward with machines, factories, and ideologies. The Ottoman past became something uncomfortable, a mirror of everything the new Turkey wanted to escape. Ataturk's republic looked westward, rewriting alphabets, laws, and even time itself. Yet even as Turkey modernized, it carried the empire's heart within. The rhythm of prayer, the architecture of its cities, the generosity of its markets, all whispered Ottoman. A century later, those same rhythms still pulse under the neon lights of modern Istanbul. Empires end on paper, cultures never do. The lands once ruled. Across the Middle East, the Ottoman ghost shaped nations that didn't exist before. Borders cut by rulers in Europe created countries that would forever struggle to find balance. Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, all carved from Ottoman provinces that once shared a single currency, postal system, and sense of belonging. What followed was confusion. Tribes were split between nations. Minorities were left without homes. Old loyalties vanished. New flags rose overnight. Colonial powers filled the vacuum, claiming they were bringing order, but they were only redrawing the empire's map for themselves. The Ottomans had once ruled through compromise. Their successors ruled through division. And the world would pay the price for that difference. The lost unity. For centuries, the empire had held dozens of religions, languages, and ethnicities under one roof. That balance was imperfect, but it was balance. When it disappeared, so did the last structure that held the Middle East together. The fall of the caliphate left a wound that no nation could heal. Muslims across the world suddenly found themselves without a center, without a voice that claimed to speak for all. Some saw this as freedom. Others saw it as abandonment. Every generation since has asked the same question in new words. Can unity exist without empire? Can faith survive without power? The Ottoman bloodline, the last heirs of the House of Osman, lived quietly in exile for decades. They gave music lessons in Paris, drove taxis in Cairo, and sold family jewelry to survive. Their titles meant nothing. Their lineage everything. When Turkey finally allowed them to return in the late 20th century, most refused. They had grown old abroad, carrying memories of palaces they would never see again. The empire they represented existed only in old photographs and fading stories. And yet, when one of the last Ottoman princesses died in 2012, her funeral drew crowds that filled the streets of Istanbul. People wept not for the monarchy, but for the reminder of what their past had once been. Vast, powerful, and complicated. The revival of memory. By the 21st century, the Ottoman Empire had returned, not in politics but in imagination. Turkish television dramas retold its stories to millions. Tourists from every corner of the world walked through its palaces, taking selfies under its domes. New generations began to ask, who were we before the modern world began? For some, the empire became nostalgia, a time of order, beauty, and unity. For others, it remained a symbol of control and hierarchy. But in both memories, glory and grief, the empire lived again. Because history is never about the past. It is about how we remember it. The echo in modern conflicts. Look at a map of today's crises. The wars in Syria, the tensions in the Balkans, the disputes over Jerusalem, the fragile borders of Iraq. Almost all are drawn along the ghost lines of Ottoman frontiers. The empire's collapse left behind a world built on fragile compromise. It created countries without shared history, borders without meaning, governments without legitimacy. A century later, the cracks still show. Each war, each peace treaty, each uprising, all trace back to the day the empire fell. The world never replaced what it lost. It merely divided it. The legacy of balance. Despite everything, the Ottomans left behind something rare: the art of coexistence. For centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side under Ottoman rule, often more peacefully than in modern states. Markets mixed languages, prayers overlapped, and laws adapted to difference. It was not perfection, but it was tolerance born of pragmatism. That lesson is more relevant today than ever. Empires rise on power, but they survive on balance. The Ottomans mastered that balance longer than most civilizations in history. The new Ottomanism. In recent decades, Turkey has begun to re-examine its imperial past not as shame, but as heritage. Politicians invoke Ottoman grandeur. Artists reclaim its aesthetics. Historians rediscover its archives. Some call it pride. Others call it danger. But whether seen as warning or inspiration, the empire's image has returned to public life. The story is no longer just history, it's identity. Because when a nation forgets where it came from, it forgets where it's going. And when it remembers too perfectly, it risks repeating what destroyed it. A civilization's whisper. Empires are like stars. They burn bright, die, and scatter their elements across space. What remains becomes the material for new worlds. The Ottoman Empire's fall scattered ideas: governance, art, culture, law, and coexistence. Those fragments became the DNA of dozens of nations. Its light still shines, faint but persistent, in everything from Arabic calligraphy to Balkan music to the arches of Istanbul's mosques. The empire's body died. Its soul became the soil beneath modern civilization. The mirror of power. Every superpower since has walked the same path the Ottomans once did. They expand, grow wealthy, and forget why they began. They silence the thinkers, worship stability, and mistake comfort for immortality. But no empire can outlive time. Whether Roman, British, Soviet, or American, all follow the same arc. Rise, peak, stagnate, fall. The Ottoman story is the warning carved into that cycle. Those who forget history do not repeat it. They repeat its blindness. The last call over the Bosporus. Even now, at sunset, when the call to prayer echoes across Istanbul's skyline, it carries 600 years of memory. The sound drifts over minarets built by sultans, across bridges built by reformers, through skyscrapers raised by modern hands. It passes the graves of the forgotten, the domes of the conquerors, and the windows of the young who no longer remember their names. History doesn't live in books. It lives in sound, in stone, in silence. And in that silence, you can still hear the pulse of an empire that refused to vanish. Empires fall. But what they teach endures, that greatness is not measured in conquest, but in continuity. That true civilization is not built by swords, but by the bridges left behind. The Ottomans rose from tribes and dreams. They fell by arrogance and time. Yet between those two moments, they held the world's center for 6 centuries. And in doing so, defined what it means to rule, to endure, and to fade. The world that followed still walks on their ruins, still lives in their wake. And every time the sun sets over the Bosporus, the empire rises again. Not in power, but in memory. The empire fell, but history never does. It only changes its language and waits for us to listen. The fall of the Ottoman Empire, the weight of memory beyond time. The empire has been gone for a century. But every night, when the lights of Istanbul flicker over the Bosporus, the past still breathes beneath the surface. The marble stones remember the footsteps of sultans. The air remembers the prayers of millions. And the city itself, a bridge of continents, still hums with the sound of history refusing to die. Empires end when their people stop believing in them. But memory is a different kind of empire, one built not on territory, but on meaning. And meaning, once born, never really dies. The city of two shadows. Walk through Istanbul at dawn. Mist curls over the water as the first ferry leaves the Asian shore. From one mosque to another, the call to prayer ripples across rooftops, echoing against the glass towers of a modern skyline. Old and new sing the same song in different languages. This is the paradox of the empire's legacy, a civilization that fell and yet remains everywhere. The sound of footsteps in the Grand Bazaar, the smell of roasted coffee in narrow alleys, the blue tiles reflecting sunlight inside the Suleymani Mosque, all whisper the same truth. The Ottomans are gone, but their world endures in every detail too subtle to erase. The weight of continuity. Every generation inherits a world they did not make. For those who live in the lands once ruled by the Crescent Banner, that inheritance is heavy. It is carried in architecture, cuisine, family names, and faith. It lives in the rhythm of Turkish speech, in the calligraphy on a Syrian wall, in the music of a Bosnian prayer. These traces do not belong to nostalgia, they belong to identity. And identity is history remembered through the body. Empires shape not only maps but minds. The Ottoman Empire shaped the emotional geography of half the planet, how people saw order, faith, and belonging. To erase it completely would be to erase the memory of coexistence itself. The forgotten language of harmony. Before it fell, the Ottoman world had mastered something the modern world still struggles to learn: how to let difference exist without fear. A century later, the nations born from its ruins have spent lifetimes trying to rebuild what the empire once managed through instinct: coexistence. In Sarajevo, the call to prayer still rises beside church bells. In Jerusalem, Ottoman stones still hold the walls that guard three faiths. In Cairo, the domes built by imperial architects still cast their shadows on the poor and the powerful alike. They are not monuments. They are reminders that civilization is not destroyed by war, but by forgetting how to share space. The empire inside us. Every empire leaves two legacies. One written in marble, the other in the human soul. The marble decays, the soul lingers. The Ottomans taught their world a rhythm, not of conquest, but of patience. They built slowly, ruled steadily, and fell gradually. They believed that time could be managed like an empire itself, by discipline, by ritual, by faith. When the world became faster, they could not keep up. But their slower rhythm, their sense of continuity, may yet be what the modern world needs most, in an age that confuses speed with progress. Their ruins do not warn us of power lost. They warn us of balance abandoned. The mirror of civilization. Every generation thinks itself modern until it looks back. The Ottomans believed they stood at history's center. So did Rome, so does the world today. But the lesson of empire is humility, that no civilization, no matter how vast, is immune to time. If you stand on the Galata Bridge at sunset and watch the ferries move between continents, you can feel the rhythm of something ancient. Not dominance, not decay, but endurance. It is the heartbeat of continuity. And perhaps that is the true secret of empire. Not to last forever, but to teach others how to. The whisper of stones. In Topkapi's courtyards, the marble still holds the chill of centuries. Tourists pass, taking pictures of rooms where fate was once decided. But if you listen carefully, the silence speaks. It speaks of ambition that turned into arrogance, of reform that came too late, of a world that was both magnificent and mortal. It does not beg for resurrection, it asks for understanding. Because to understand the empire's fall is to understand the limits of every human design. Empires are mirrors in which humanity sees its own reflection. Glorious, flawed, impermanent. The eternal Bosporus. At night, the Bosporus glows with reflections of ships and city lights. Seagulls circle above the minarets. From one shore, you can see the continent where history began. From the other, the continent where it is still being written. This is where East and West still meet, not in war or alliance, but in the simple act of coexisting under the same sky. The Ottomans once ruled this water as conquerors. Now it belongs to everyone. Perhaps that is the empire's greatest victory, that it outlived its own authority and became part of the world it once tried to control. The empire's story is not about sultans or palaces. It is about time itself, how civilizations rise, shine, and fade, leaving their light behind like the afterglow of a dying star. The Ottomans believed they were chosen to bring order to chaos, faith to unbelief, unity to division. For centuries, they did. And when they failed, the world inherited their fragments, beautiful, broken, and enduring. Today, when the sun sets over the domes of Istanbul, its light touches both the ruins of the past and the glass of the future. In that light, both worlds merge, and you realize the empire never really ended. It simply became the world we live in. Empires do not vanish, they evolve into memory. And memory, when told with truth, becomes immortality.